welcome to today's Survivor Circle session, our very first topical discussion session. I'm so excited to talk about the really important topic of healthy boundaries for adult survivors. So, welcome from wherever you're joining us from. Just a couple of notes before we get started about how to participate in today's session. If you're on the Survivor Space site right now, there's a chat box there. You are able to type into that chat box at any time. If you have a question, a comment, you want to respond to something that has been said, please type in there at any time. To view this session, hopefully you're seeing it already on the right side of your screen. If you want to make the screen larger, this is being live streamed on YouTube. So you can click on a little box in the bottom right corner of the screen and it should expand it for you. Again, feel free to type in the chat at any point and we will do our best to respond as quickly as we can. But we're very excited that you're here, and I'm just honored to welcome two of my favorite human beings ever to today's discussion, Angie Kahn and Sarah Helms. I'm so pleased to welcome them. I will let them say what they would like to about themselves, and without further ado, welcome.
Thanks, Becky. Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be here and rejoin my dear friend Sarah Helms to do this. So,
absolutely. Yeah. And we get to talk about one of our favorite topics. Angie and I have co-facilitated a variety of groups on a variety of topics, but I think boundaries is maybe one of, as I say, favorite. And then there's well, but what about that one? But I think boundaries is it's an important topic. For everybody, but I think especially for survivors of trauma, this is such a critical topic, and it's one that it's hard, it's layered, there's a lot to it, and so it's kind of on the surface, it's kind of easy to be like, oh, boundaries, I get that, but then when you start doing the deep work on this, there's a lot. So
yeah, I mean the roots on boundaries run deep. Right. For any of us, but especially for those of us that have experienced childhood trauma, childhood sexual abuse, childhood abuse, they're just deep. And they, like you said, Sarah, they're so complex. There's so many facets and layers. And just when you think you're working really hard, and you are, right, you're working really hard on something, then boom, something else comes that has to do with boundaries. And yeah, you have to dig in and go at it again. And it's sometimes exhausting, I want to say.
Yeah.
So,
well, before we go too far into all the nuance of the hardest, grittiest parts of it, which we dived into right at the beginning, maybe we start with just talking a little bit about, for us, what our definition would be of what does it mean when we even say boundaries for people who may be newer to this work, who are maybe I don't even know where to start with this. For me, the definition of a boundary, if you go to the dictionary definition, a boundary, when you think about geography or the limits of the lines around, right? This is the line, my state line or my city line. That's a boundary, and it's a limit. It sets the line between this is your land and this is my land. When you start talking about relationships and feelings and all of the stuff that gets so muddy so quickly, that line of saying what's the limit, what feels safe for me, what's the limits of what I'm comfortable with or not comfortable with, all of that stuff I think gets so much murkier, and it can vary based so much on where you're at emotionally, minute to minute, day to day, situations, different contexts, different situations you might have different boundaries in. Different people who you're relating to, might feel differently. So yeah, I think at its purest form, it's sort of easy, that superficial limit of saying a boundary is a limit. But then it's oh man, okay, that's a lot then.
Yeah, I agree. I see things in pictures a lot. So I just, when I'm thinking about boundaries, it's kind of similar to what you said, Sarah, where I see kind of my yard and my space and where do I want to put my fence with, and it changes with each person. I do an activity with young people where they're seating across the room from one another. And one of them stays still and the other walks towards them. And when that person that's standing still is comfortable, they'll put their hand out and say, stop. And it's kind of like that in an emotional sense, in a physical sense, in a intellectual sense, whatever we need the boundary around it. I see it like that. Like, where am I comfortable in this space? Where do I feel most safe and protected?
Yeah. Yeah, I love you mentioned that too, because there are different types of boundaries, right? There's physical boundaries of like space, how close feels too close. And that's going to be different if I'm with a stranger than with my partner or my children, or right. Like, so physical boundaries, emotional boundaries, boundaries with your time or your resources. Like, there's so many different types of boundaries. So I think that's also an important distinction. Thank you for making that one.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the most important thing when we're thinking about how do we even begin to set boundaries, especially after trauma, when boundaries have been so blurry, is really giving ourselves some self-compassion when it comes to boundaries, and knowing like it's not a race, it's a lifelong journey. We're going to get there as long as we're working towards what our goals are with our own boundaries with others.
Yeah. Well, and so when we think about all the layers of boundaries, there's the boundaries that I have, like my own personal boundaries for myself. Then when we're talking about being in relationship with people, whether that's, you know, a work relationship or an intimate partner or a friend or a child, you know, there's my boundary. Then there's that other person and all of their stuff and all of their boundaries and what feels okay for them. Right. And let me rewind for a second. There's no right or wrong answer to this, right? Like, my boundary and your boundary are likely to be different if we pull in different topics. If we talk long enough, we're going to find we might have a lot where we agree and we might have some where we disagree, because our personalities are different. Our life experiences are different. We have different values. We have different beliefs, right? So it's not like right or wrong. It's really about what feels right for me. And then when we start talking about layering in relationships, okay, what feels right for that other person? Or if there's a bunch of people involved, for each of those other people. And so everybody's kind of doing that individual work, hopefully, or maybe some of them aren't, but that's a different conversation. But then when you're trying to communicate about those boundaries, right? Like, what's my comfort zone? What's that person's comfort zone? Now, how do we come together and talk about it and grapple with it and find where that common ground is and how we can make stuff work? That's another whole piece of it.
Oh, for sure. Because, you know, typically we're thinking about us, right? Like, and rightly so. You're thinking about yourself and what your comfort zone is and where you want to, what you're okay with and what you're not okay with. And then especially when the people are closer to you, right? Closer to you, you know, in your own life. And so my spouse or my kids, and, you know, as they're growing and changing too, their boundaries change as well. And it's like you just when you think you kind of find your rhythm, you know, for me, I'll just use my kids as an example. My kids growing up, and all of a sudden they are not a child, they're a teenager. And so their boundaries shift, which rightly so. They should have that freedom and that autonomy to shift their boundaries as a human being. But mine as a mom, right? I want to keep continuing to physically maybe, or even like as far as boundaries as giving advice to my kids. My kids are adults now, and so I don't give them input the same way I did when they were little, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's so complicated and layered and exhausting, and
yeah. And it's a delicate balance. So, you know, when we start thinking about all this, you know, my limits, their limits, our relationship together, how this is evolving and growing over time, or based on different situations, all of that. There's this level of figuring out, how do I find the right balance and the right compromise without compromising my values, right? Like, I think that word compromise can be really loaded when we get into boundary work, because it's like compromising with someone is not a bad thing, right? Like, okay, we need to find some common ground. How can we make this work? but it gets into that trouble zone when it's like, but now I'm compromising stuff about who I am as a person, what my values are. This has crossed a line that I can't be okay with.
Yeah, especially if there are certain words like compromise or different words that have been used against you in the past. You really have to zone in and redefine your narrative. Sometimes I know I do have to redefine my narrative around certain words that have been really like trigger words for me. And compromise is one of those words where, even as you said it, I kind of felt myself inside like, shrink up, right? And so understanding it's okay to rewrite narratives around certain words and redefine those for ourselves as we're growing healthier or as we're doing some inner work.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and as the intensity and the sort of the valence of the topic shifts, right? Like I can compromise with my partner about are we having pizza or subs for dinner? That's a compromise. I cannot compromise my values. I cannot compromise certain limits where I say, this is a line that I'm not comfortable crossing. I cannot be okay with myself if we do that, right? So that's where it's like, how do we redefine what some of this means? And how do we apply it in different situations to where we can be flexible, but without like bend but not break, right? Like how can we find that gray zone of what's okay and we're comfortable with, but not go to a place that we're not comfortable with?
Yeah. And then set those, follow through on that too, because there's one thing about doing that searching and defining those areas. It's then becomes another when you're activating that and you're putting that into action, especially if it hasn't been a regular practice that you've held for so many years. And so following through with it is sometimes the hardest part. I think sometimes we know what boundaries we want to set with others, what boundaries we need to set with others, and then following through with that is a whole other journey.
Well, because knowing it and doing it are different things, but also, and I'm not picking on you about this. This is so true for me too, but like sticking with a boundary might be a boundary issue too, right? Like here's my boundary about whatever other topic, about my time and resources, or about my lunch preference of pizza or subs, like whatever the preference or the limit is, that's a boundary that I'm trying to set. But the practice of holding firm, that's a completely new set of boundaries and skills, right? The practice of healthy communication with a partner and being firm without being aggressive and all that. Like each of those in its own self might be its own boundary issue that you're working on, right? So it's like the content, the topic that we're trying to navigate, but also the process that we do it by. Both of those is like getting tag teamed, you know?
Yeah, the Wonder Twin powers activate.
Yeah,
the
one
thing where
punch.
you know it and it's time to do it. Yeah, and respecting others' boundaries as well. Because there's that needs to be activated as well, and not getting offended when somebody sets a boundary with us.
So I see we're getting some questions coming in. Before we move over to that, I know we had one topic that we really wanted to be sure to touch on specifically for this group. We've talked about boundaries in other settings before, but specifically for survivors, because that's the group that we're meeting with today. What are your thoughts on specifically for survivors, why this is so tough, where like the roots of this for you, like where would you go with that topic about like specifically for survivors?
Yeah, I was thinking about this before we hopped on today as I was getting ready, and why boundaries are so complex and why they're so multifaceted. And it really, following the root, I always like to say, okay, let me follow the root when I'm feeling something to certain places in my body. And it really stems from way back in my childhood where I grew up in a space where as a child, I wasn't allowed to have boundaries. I wasn't allowed to tell people no. I wasn't allowed to tell the grown-ups in my life, no, and set those boundaries. And so that lens was developed very young in my life, and it affected everything as I grew into, an elementary age kid, and then a a tween, and then an adolescent, and into my young adulthood. It shaped everything. It was a lens of which I saw everything in my life from that point on, and what was okay for people to cross, coming towards me, and what me going towards others. Because if others could set boundaries, and I was like, I have to respect those boundaries, especially adults as a child. And so it gets really, really murky in that sense. And I think that's why it's so hard as an adult, when we want to heal from being a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, like healing from that, it feels so much more intense when we think about certain things like boundaries, or any kind of healing work that we do.
Yeah. So on the one hand, there's this one piece of it where the environment that we grew up in, as children or teens or young adults, there's a lot of indirect messages. And it sounds like there were definitely some indirect messages you received. And this is so common, right? That children are supposed to be seen and not heard, or children need to, obey, or, all of these kind of implicit messages that might be directly taught, like in an instruction that you're told you have to do this, or it might just be the culture that you're surrounded by, where you just kind of see it and absorb it. And just, that's what feels normal because that's what you grew up in. And then layering on that, where that's the norm, but then you encounter individuals, potentially abusers or potentially others, but who use that and weaponize it against you. People who know how to very intentionally and maliciously push boundaries, push limits, train you up to where that becomes like there are no boundaries, there are no limits, because we've just systematically eroded them step by step.
Yeah. And then that becomes that space as you're out on your own and away from that abuse, as I've grown up and been away from that in the beginning of my healing journey. That was, I would say, I felt like as a survivor, I felt like I would always say, do I have a neon sign? Because it would seem like the types of people that like to erode boundaries were always around me. They were always infiltrating my life. They were always like showing up. And somehow I get sucked into that vortex. And just felt like it was in this perpetual endless circle of abusers.
Yeah. Well, and also when you didn't grow up in a space that taught you how to have healthy communication and healthy boundaries, and even modeled, like, what does a healthy relationship even look like? If you don't grow up seeing that, absorbing that, learning that in all the different ways, directly and indirectly, how do you even know where to start with setting a boundary when you've literally never seen one done effectively? Like, how are you supposed to tackle that? That's where it gets really hard.
Yeah, because, growing up in a space where there's abuse involved, the boundaries that are being pushed by the person that's grooming you, or the person, or even those adults in our life that just don't have their own healthy boundaries. And you see you're supposed to be a certain way, do a certain thing, that there are it's kind of like an elastic band that gets stretched and stretched and stretched, and it's like it cannot go back to the way that it's supposed to be. And so as you move into your adulthood, your adolescence and adulthood, that rubber band's just stretched. And so then you have like you said, Sarah, you have no reference point in which to gauge healthy or unhealthy, or even know that it's not healthy, because it's all you know. When certain things are all you know, you think everybody is in the same space you are. And so you're approaching it in such a way that it sets you up in many, many situations.
Yeah. It's that whole thing, like the fish don't know they're wet, right? And it's one thing as you get older and you have other experiences, and maybe you do some healing work, or you do some reading, or you get in some healthy relationships, you can kind of know it up here. Like, yeah, I know this or that thing, like that wasn't right. But to really internalize a feeling like deep in your soul, that's like a different model for how the world can look. that's not something that just is a light switch on and off. And you can't go from having not had those experiences to just being like, oh, now I know it. I feel it. It's deep in my core. I got like, that's a lifelong journey.
Yeah. And it's also, I say knowing it here and knowing it is the longest, 18 inches that I've ever traveled in my whole life and continue to travel is having those connected. That's why I'm so passionate about like somatic and embodiment work, because it helps me to connect that space that's been so disjointed on purpose for so long. Because you're right, knowing it, there were so many years where it was like, I know it, I have the head knowledge, I know what I need to be doing. And every time, just my visceral reactions would be those reactions and patterns from childhood. And I would have this disjointedness that would really affect my self-esteem. It would really affect how I showed up in the world with other people, what I was allowing, what I was, willing to do. Like all of those things were just so messy until, I slowed down and got in my still space for my own healing journey and was like, I don't want to feel like this anymore. I don't want people to come into my space. Enough. Like this enough. And that journey is so uniquely different for each survivor. And so, like you said in the beginning, there's no right or wrong way. Like this is your journey. If you're out there and you're listening, this is your journey. There's no right or wrong way. We want to have these conversations to just start the conversation and put the conversation on the table and then let you further explore it. I feel like this is a conversation that's not going to have just a beginning and an end today. This is just the opening the door for the conversation in people's lives.
Definitely. Well, so then expanding on that a little bit, going from, okay, why is this so hard for survivors? Then I think the next piece of that is then like, what are the things that we tell ourselves as adults that maybe these are kind of myths or misconceptions or just like the things that we do that gets in our own way, right? So now it's like we've reached a point where we're wanting to do this work. We're starting to see it up here, but to kind of take it down to that deeper level, like you're talking about, like how do we then tackle all of that piece of like, what do I say to myself that's not actually true or that maybe pulls me to where I'm not doing my best work at this?
Yeah, I think it's identifying the lies, right? That we're gonna kind of zoom out if we're looking at our life from like an aerial view, and identifying those lies, those places in our life that keep us trapped, that keep us held back from being the version of ourselves that we want to be, that we know we deserve to be. Even though sometimes we don't feel like we deserve it. And so that might be a lie. Like, I don't deserve anything better than this or anything other than this. Or I don't have a right to say no. And it's really those messages about yourself, like identifying what are the messages that are false that you're telling yourself about yourself.
Yeah. So I'm hearing some red flag words there that I would kind of group into one category around self-esteem, more like a depressive kind of a place that can kind of pull you down to a darker place, which are statements about yourself, I statements, but like I can't, I don't, I won't ever, stuff like that. That's kind of taking you back maybe to some of those old patterns. I would add on that and say, maybe some like red flags that you might notice in those thought streams when you're talking to yourself, when you get into your head, what if, or kind of predicting like, well, what if it goes this way? Or what if I do this? And then that person reacts like that, might be pulling you more towards that anxiety or that people pleasing, perfectionism, some of those worries. I think that's another big piece of it. I think a lot of times too, a lot of stuff can be kind of black or white, and it's hard to get into that gray zone. So like the pendulum can swing really far to one side where it's like, well, oh gosh, I can't do that. I don't want to be mean, or I don't want to be too tough or what, And then it can swing way to the other side of like, well, I'm not going to be taken advantage of. Like, you're not going to push me around. Like, I can't show a softer, vulnerable side because someone's going to come in and snatch that up. Right. That pendulum can go from one to another in the same situation. Even you can have those swings. But I think
it can be that extreme codependence to that extreme ultra independence where I don't need anybody. I can only rely on myself. All those messages, right? I don't need anybody. All I have is myself to rely on. I can only depend on myself too. Like I can't live without this person or these people and so those two extremes, that pendulum of swinging back and forth, and they can change too. We can go from, the people pleasing and the wanting to always, not offend anybody, right? We don't want to offend anybody. We don't want anybody upset with us. We want everybody to like us. And so, it can go. And that's a really confusing place to be. And that might be even part of the first awareness that we know. Like we're looking at our relationships, we're assessing each, like our professional relationships, our personal relationships, our friendships, our family relationships. Like as we assess those, what are the messages that we're telling ourselves within each of those spaces too?
Yeah. I want to go back to one thing you said because it was so good. That like ultra independence versus that ultra codependence. It immediately took me to that visual where you started, right? Like it is not productive for me to build a fence that is so tight around my body that I'm like shimmying my way around because I can't, right? It's like there's no room. Nobody's getting in. Nobody's getting out. It's very restrictive.
Yeah.
But then the opposite end of that where it's like, I don't even have any fence. I don't have any walls. There's no, like, I'm just walking around through this world and anything and anybody and everybody can just come right on in. Both of those extremes, right? That's that pendulum swing from like too much to not enough and back and forth.
Yeah. And within that, as maybe we're just starting our journey of setting boundaries, we swing from like, we might go to that ultra independence and feel that tightness, like maybe even physically feel that feels very constraining and very, maybe even the tightness of it. And then swinging out, like getting scared, right? When we're first starting to set boundaries and swinging out to the other extreme of, or getting frustrated and just being like, going back to old patterns or what feels familiar and safe, even though we know it's been proven to us time and time again, doesn't feel good, or it's not what we want. It's not our goal.
Yeah. Well, I want to make sure we've got 2 comments in the chat. So I'm going to scroll up and take a look at those and we can kind of tackle those. So we had one person who mentioned asking us to address the question of how to make appropriate boundaries around family events that include a perpetrator. So this person says that at one celebration of life or a memorial gathering that they had attended, a perpetrator who was related was going to attend. It was unsafe for many of us, and a stranger showed up as well. I was told that the stranger actually was a bodyguard whose job it was to stay with the perpetrator and ensure group safety throughout the event. I never had heard of such a thing. What types of precautions or boundaries can we set if we have family members in denial who want to include perpetrators in events? And then how do we draw those lines?
Oh, yeah. Just want to take a second here and maybe even take a breath, because there's a lot of layers to that. And that's a very personal question, right? And so I want to caution people not to judge other people and to approach other people with the lens that everybody's on their journey, right? And what I would do might not necessarily be what someone else would do. And we're all in different spaces in healing. And so that's, because this brings up a lot, just listening to you read that and looking, it brings up a lot for me of, trusting what other people are saying about the situation, because you don't have that knowledge yourself, right? So that's a boundary in itself. And I think for me, I would look at where am I in my life with my healing? Where am I with my family of origin? What are boundaries have I set, if any, and what boundaries do I want to set? Because where the space that I'm in now, I wouldn't be around. I don't want to be around people that have harmed me from my family of origin, and so my boundary with that is complete. Not even being in the same space, but that's maybe not a boundary someone else has, and so being very gentle around what other people need in their life. Let's see. I think even in this, it sounds like there's more than one person that's being affected or that has been affected by abuse in this situation. And I think I think perpetrators rely on secrecy. They rely on people being isolated and not talking. They rely on victims not talking to one another, not having communication with one another. And so in a situation like this, if you know, like there's more than one person, like coming together in unity and making a plan together would be a good start. Instead of feeling like you have to take it on yourself and be the one that is quote unquote the bad guy that's causing, strife or division in a family. Right.
Yeah, I was definitely thinking, I mean, this is such a complicated situation and so personal, so deeply personal on the level of the abuse, as well as on the level of the loss, whoever, the memorial service was for. And so you're in the grief process around that loss while you're also navigating this level of trauma. It's just, it's a lot. But relying on those supports, like you said, Angie, I mean, that feels like a way to work through what's my boundary? What are each of these other people's boundaries? Is there some common ground there where we can connect and feel supported and feel that we're meeting all of our needs? Because it sounds like in this situation, there's a need to not be around the perpetrator and a need to be at this celebration of life or memorial service. And so when two needs are going head to head like that in a space where you feel very trapped and you obviously they're in direct competition. Sometimes those can be some of the hardest boundary conversations to navigate because it's murky and there's this overlap where you feel like you're going to have a trade-off, and those trade-offs never feel good. Those never sit well.
Yeah, and you feel this is celebration of life and a memorial that you want to honor the person, right? And you feel maybe even robbed of your ability to just be in that space freely because you have all of these elements that have wounded you so much. And so having that support is so important, but even giving maybe some thought to the other people, maybe having another celebration of life where it was just that the people in your life that you want to be in your life. Maybe you have support from friends and family that love you and that has been on this journey with you, and having a mini service that's just a private one so that you can have that open space to really freely, fully grieve and fully be present, because you're always on guard. In this situation, I would be so hyper vigilant and so on guard, knowing that perpetrator was in that space. Even if they were clear across the room and it's a huge space, my brain knows, my body knows that person is there and there is danger. And there's no ability for the nervous system to relax in that situation. There's no ability for your grief to be free. And for you to fully be able to allow yourself to grieve and to celebrate, right? To celebrate the life that you love, that's no longer. So,
yeah, I do think when we have those moments where we're feeling that conflict, right? It's like it's this going up against this head to head. Any pivot like that, I mean, that's such a beautiful idea of, well, if this particular day and this particular service is not going to meet my needs, how can I create something that will? And maybe that's a private moment that you have something on your own. Maybe that's bringing in a select group of people. That's where the boundaries can actually be really leveraged to your advantage, to figure out, how do I know what I need? How do I know how I can create something? And then we can pivot and create that in a different way. And to kind of free yourself from that lens of it's either this or it's this, because that's a losing battle, right? Especially when you don't have control over either of those pieces. You don't have control over the guest list of this event. You don't have control over this other person's behavior. And anytime that we have stuff that's out of our control, it's always going to be triggering from a trauma perspective.
Yeah. And you walk away from that space, that event, with all of those messagings that maybe you've been working on to get that all of them start to resurface.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We had another comment in here. One thing that helped me with boundaries was actually teaching them to my children, using some great children's books with them. 2 basic books were I Like You to Make Jokes with Me, but I Don't Like You to Touch Me, and It's My Body. These basic children's books were a good starting point for them. Are there any basic texts, poems, or resources that have helped you?
Oh, that's so good. Yeah, because there's so much attached to that when we talk about our children and our trauma and raising kids. Yeah, it's I think for me, when my kids were younger, just reminding them, you don't have to allow anyone to hug you. You don't have to hug anyone that you don't want to, even if they're family. Like they're and letting and reminding them before we go to an event, and reminding them when we get to the event in front of everybody. Because I want the adults in the space to hear that what I'm saying to my child, and the boundary that that they have a right to set. So I love that they put these books in here too, because that's how, especially when our children are little and we're teaching them, they're mirroring what they see. They're mirroring, like, what are the boundaries that we have? They're mirroring, figuring out, like, a small child when they're tiny. I remember, like, reaching out to my kids and trying to protect them from falling or something, and they pushed my hand away. Like, no. Right. And so even very, very young, there's this innate, automatic wisdom in us to want to set our own boundaries. And then some that gets quieted when you have people that are abusing and taking advantage of that. There are so many. I know, Sarah, you have some quotes that I absolutely love.
So I did pull a couple of quotes. I'll share them because in the past, when we've done like talks about boundaries, we've always had slides, and this is just a conversation, so we don't have slides, but I pulled some quotes we have used together on old slides. One of them is from Brene Brown, who we both love and does such good work. So this quote is, "Daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves, even when we risk disappointing others." So I love that. And that, again, going back to some of those myths and misconceptions we were talking about, I think that quote really does such a beautiful job of that idea of, like, where is my responsibility to myself, and how do I prioritize that in a situation when there is that fear of disappointing someone else or letting someone else down. All of those self-doubts and that talk can kind of creep in.
Yeah.
Another quote. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. I was thinking of the quote that we would use when we would do our boundary talk together on boundaries is the space in which I can love you and me simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. Prentice Hemphill. That was my next one on my list. You got it. You got it right.
Yeah. And so when I think about that, because I'm thinking about Brene Brown's quote that you said about not wanting to disappoint. And I think, how can we reframe that? I don't want to disappoint myself anymore. Like, I deserve not to be disappointed just as much as somebody else. And I say that not in an arrogant way, but in a way that defends those younger parts of me that always felt like I was a disappointment, and therefore boundaries would get crossed. So So I'm thinking about that when I'm thinking about the quote on boundaries are the space in which I can love you and me simultaneously. And it really, I'm really good at loving or feeling like I'm loving other people. I wasn't so good at feeling like I want to love myself. And so on that journey, just cultivating that relationship with yourself and nourishing yourself and realizing that I want to love myself and I do want to love others. I want to have that healthy balance. And so how do I make that possible while, setting those boundaries that are right in the middle instead of two over here, two over here.
Yeah. Another thing I love about that quote from Prentice Hemphill is this idea of the mutuality of it instead of pitting it as an either or. And if you've seen any of my videos on the survivor space, like this is a big thing I always come back to. It's not this or that. It's not A versus B. It's both and, right? And so simultaneously loving myself and also loving you, it pivots that lens to where we're not saying, well, I'm more important or you're more important or how do I hierarchically rank this? It's like, no, it's both this and this, both at the same time. That duality, which I love about that quote specifically.
Yeah. And Sarah, I think you were you were the first person which is shocking, but amazing that introduced that concept to me, that these two things, can be, I love someone else and I love, because it doesn't have to be. I think survivors grow up in such an either or space. Like we grew up in such a, it has to be this or it has to be this space that in the beginning, that feels kind of like, oh, I don't know about that. And then the more that we flow into that space and we allow that to be the truth that resonates, the more comfortable and the more confident we become in that simultaneous space.
Mm-hmm. And I think that idea is so big with boundaries because often, well, just like that example we were talking about, we have two things that are going kind of head to head, right? And so it's like, I want to be able to attend this memorial service, but I don't want to be around this abuser, right? And so when we replace that but with an and, it starts to shift that to that idea of the duality of it. I want to go to this service and I want to avoid this person, right? And so we don't have to say, well, it's this, but this, no matter what the topic, when we're saying, well, I like this, but there's also this other thing, we can get deep into that with boundary work where you start to kind of undermine yourself. Like, well, I don't really have time for this, but I owe it to this person, or I need to do this. Like you can get into that quickly when you substitute that and of saying, yes, I know I owe this person a favor from long ago when we had this conversation, and I'm not in a space to fulfill that obligation today. Right. Mm-hmm. So you can kind of shift that language to accept both of them at the same time.
Yeah. And we can change our mind on things, right? We
Yes.
have the right to withdraw, those obligations, right? Like
I know I said this back then.
Yeah.
And today, here's where I'm at, which is a different space.
Mm-hmm. Based on the information that you have then, Correct. And so as far as I know you have another quote that I love. I want to talk about that when I'm going to put in like my resources. I'll enter those in down in the chat. So if you want to check back, whoever asked the question, if they want to check back, we'll add some resources and even to our resource page too, to be able to have those on hand.
Yeah. So one more quote that we had, which we've used in some prior trainings, and then I want to go back to that other question one more time before we move on. I see we have another question, but we have plenty of time. We've still got 15 minutes. So the last quote is, the only people who get upset about you setting boundaries are the ones who were benefiting from you having none. And that is like a moment for me. The first time I saw that, I was just like, yeah, it just like it clicks like, oh, okay, yeah, the reason that I'm getting this pushback is because holding on to this boundary of what I need is no longer convenient for this person. It's no longer serving their needs. There's not a mutuality. There's not a connection and relationship. There's not a commitment to us treating each other in ways that are healthy and respectful. This is about okay, now I see the true colors, right?
Yeah.
That's such a light bulb moment when you kind of see that.
Yeah, and sometimes, especially this one is such an empowering quote. It's one of those quotes that the more you read it, oh, the more like, like I feel like the more relaxed my shoulders get, and the more like I want to like the more I lean into it. And so maybe even taking some quotes that you really find to be truth in your life and saying them in front of a mirror or affirmation, using them as affirmations. Maybe if you're not comfortable saying them in front of a mirror, like standing up in a power pose and saying them, so that your body, it starts to settle in your body, right? And it becomes a truth in your body, because we do, again, we want to move that truth from our head into our bodies, so that we're not having those instantaneous reactions that we're working so hard to override. And so
Yeah.
I love that quote.
The only other thing I wanted to go back to the question about, because I love this. Children's books, children's programming, Daniel Tiger or whatever. Like, there are so many good things out there that I just want to encourage as adults for us to lean into, because for a few reasons. Number one, there may be some spaces where we didn't have access to that when we were at that age. So, allowing yourself to learn from, benefit from, have fun and play and get into some of that stuff, I think is healing in its own right.
Yeah.
I also love the simplicity of some of it. And sometimes when we're trying to work really hard at a new skill that doesn't come naturally, or that we're doing hard work on, we can get like up here in the clouds, like we can read these big long textbooks with big words and all this up here kind of stuff. But when you take it down to really basic levels, it helps me. I mean, I can think of examples in my own life. Like, it helps me to see certain things through a new lens. So I will give you one example for myself. I had been doing some reading around consent, and my child at the time was probably a year and a half or 2 years old, splashing around in the little tiny, tiny baby pool where it's got, like a few inches of water, and just kind of toddling around. And he was splashing water onto this other little girl who was in the pool area. And I stopped him and I said, "Buddy, you need to ask her, is it okay if I splash you, before you just go and splash her? Because we don't know if she's comfortable with that." And the other mom swooped in and was like, "Oh my gosh, don't be silly. He doesn't have to do that. She's fine." And I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. Yeah, he does need to ask. And he does need to make sure that he has consent before he does something to her body that she might not be comfortable with, right? When you start to apply these things to other things in your life, where you can see it through that different lens, like we're talking about splashing, we're not talking about abuse. We're not talking about stuff that may be deeper and harder and stuff that we're not ready to quite tackle. It just puts that other lens of like, wow, what would it have been like to grow up in a family where that was the communication, where that was the norm? That's how we have just been raised from infancy in the pool.
Yeah. And it really does reinforce having those regular conversations with your kids, even role playing and acting, they don't know that we're just playing. And even like with dolls, or with however they play, like trucks or whatever they play with, like even doing simple things like in the play that include boundaries, and that have those conversations around that. I love that, like normalizing that, starting in the pool, or starting in those common places that kids are in, before you are in a situation with other people involved, right? Like you can have those conversations on a regular basis and make it part of your natural rhythm with how you raise. Because what a difference that would make, to grow up in that space. Yeah. I love that. And I'm kind of thinking about that mom's reaction, right? And so I feel like that's just a normalized reaction of, oh, they're fine. Like, they're just kids. They're playing around. They're splashing. It's not a big deal. When in fact, as you just stated, it goes down into the roots of, that's where it starts. It doesn't start at, the finish line, right? It starts right there in those little tiny things that are naturally happening in kids' lives. So
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I'm also practicing saying no. Like, like when my kids were little, we would, practice saying no on certain things because sometimes if you have a child that's shyer, I had a child that struggled really extremely with social anxiety and would freeze when they got into a public space. So we would practice before we would go out. We would have those conversations regularly. So.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have one more question in our chat. What are some examples of ways to lovingly communicate my boundary needs with an intimate partner?
Yeah, this is a good one, and I think this is also probably one of the most challenging ones as a survivor to have those conversations and for me, what I would do, I would just I'm a very like I'm gonna run into it. I don't want to say confrontational, but yeah, like I want to have it. I want to have it all out on the table. Some people aren't like that. Some people are more cautious. And so in my situation with my partner, we have those regular conversations, about like how did that feel? Or I might go to him and say, honey, when we were in that situation, now that I've had time to think about it, this is, that I felt this way when, those I statements.
Mm-hmm.
But clarifying those examples of that for ourselves and for our intimate partner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the difficulty with this question is that there are a million ways that this could be done, and so much of it is based on my personality, my partner's personality, the rhythm of our relationship, right? There are some people who could tackle this very head on. There are other people where maybe having a little bit more distance, maybe sending a text message as a conversation starter, or maybe having a designated time where, on a certain day or time or location, we agree, like, we're going to have this conversation in this space. Some people do that work better when they're in a therapeutic setting where they have someone to help support and moderate the conversation in some way. Some people use humor more effectively than others. Some people are more direct in their communication. Some people are more indirect in their communication. Some of that is about boundaries. Some of that is about practice. There's just so many moving parts.
Yeah, that's so true. And all of those such good points, because it's about what is our rhythm with our partner. And it could be like, for instance, and I can just use my life as the launch point. But in the beginning of my relationship, I have a 22-year relationship. So in the beginning, I wasn't doing a lot of inner healing. I was in a different space than I am now that we are all these years later. And so having those conversations have come easier later because there has been. But you're so right. It just depends on the situation and the relationship and the communication styles and the history and the patterns that we develop in our intimate relationships, to what approach we're comfortable with, even approaching the topic sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So it might be that, there needs to be a therapist involved in helping you navigate that space. Or sometimes it's I know I've found this to be true in my life. It's my assumptions about what my partner's going to think if I even bring up certain topics, and I bring them up and they're like, it's not a big deal to them, where it was giant. It felt giant here, or vice versa. And so there again is all of those factors that come into the equation.
Yeah. Well, and I think Angie and I were both approaching this question from the way that we're both speaking to it, with an assumption that this intimate partner is a healthy partner, is engaged. Because the question asked how to lovingly communicate with an intimate partner. I sort of jumped to some assumptions there that may or may not be true. And so how to communicate with an intimate partner who is invested in doing this work alongside you is going to look very different from how to communicate with a partner who is emotionally checked out, or doesn't have the bandwidth to tackle something on the level where you're trying to tackle it, or who's intentionally or maliciously trying to weaponize this stuff against you, or, 1,000 other scenarios. So making sure that the approach fits the partner in that situation also might be just an important thing to think about.
Absolutely. That I'm so glad that you pointed that out, because I was coming at it from that assumption too. And so it's such a independently, depending on the relationship approach. And I would say if someone is in a relationship where they might not be able to do that, getting that extra support, either from a support group or from a therapist, that they can start to, because that is a deep dive on, because boundaries are necessary. They're non-negotiable, right? Mm-hmm. Where they used to be where they used to not be so when we didn't know what we didn't know. So yeah.
Angie, I think your point too was very well made about just the growth and the evolution that can happen in relationships. Much like you, I have been in a long-term committed relationship. My husband and I started dating when we were 15. We are now both in our mid-40s. So clearly the communication styles, thankfully, have evolved since I was 15 to, 40s. What was a healthy or appropriate boundary for us to have at different phases in the relationship have looked different, right? So there's all of these pieces too of like, as you grow as an individual, as your partner grows as an individual, and as you, hopefully, the assumptions that we started with, right, hopefully are growing and connecting and moving together as a unit through that, there's the way that those boundaries are going to be communicated about, the what the actual boundaries are, and the way that they're going to be communicated about, obviously, is going to evolve and grow with you.
So being gentle with yourself when you're setting boundaries or setting new boundaries with those in your life.
We had another user who posted an awesome recommendation, a great book called Allies in Healing, all about partner connections and supporting someone who is a survivor. Has some examples of communication and what works. We don't have a ton of time to kind of dive into that idea of how allies can support survivors. But that might be a whole other standalone conversation like this. But I think that's huge. And again, going back to that assumption that this is a person who is an ally, who is a trusted partner, makes a big difference.
Yeah.
We just had someone also say some examples would include, when you do X, I feel Y, so please do Z instead. Another example would be, we need a safe word for times when I need it. One of my friends actually made a list of triggers and handed it to her partner saying, these are the things I can't stand. Yeah. So like lots of different strategies there: verbal communication, written communication, and a method for how to pause. And I think that one is one I want to pause on for just a second before we wrap up, because sometimes the biggest part of the boundary is not yes or no, but it's, I need to pause and come back at a time when we can tackle this better, for whatever reason, for your own space, for their space.
I absolutely agree with that, because sometimes we can get so sucked into the heat of the moment, or the intensity, or those kind of things that we do need to just a pause. And I'm the type of person, I need that pause. I need to decompress for a second and sort my thoughts out, because for me, all my thoughts get all jumbled up, and then it feels like very urgent when in fact maybe it's just stepping back and sorting through those. So it's okay to push pause and assess it for yourself before approaching it too. But I think definitely for this, we've opened the conversation. There's definitely like way more conversation to be had. There's some survivor videos where others have talked about this topic on a video on our website. So I hope it's opened the doors for conversation and process.
Absolutely. And this chat remains open for a while. So anyone who's here currently, or if anyone kind of comes back, catches this stuff after the fact and wants to chime in, I would be happy to check back in a couple of times and just see if there's any additional questions, comments, or thoughts or anything.
Yeah. And we'll post some more resources and quotes and books and those kind of things too.
Absolutely. And for folks who, even after the chat for this session closes later today, if you would like to continue the discussion, please hop over to the Survivor Forum on the Survivor Space website. It's always open, and you can type a question or start a conversation there. That's always open to you. And like Angie mentioned, there are some resources on Survivor Space related to boundaries. And the easiest way to find those is go to our search function or our content library and type in boundaries, and everything that mentions boundaries will show up there. So thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm going to also put into the chat a link for a feedback survey. We would love if you could please provide some feedback about today's session. It also includes a question on what kind of topics would you like to see going forward. So please, if you have just a moment to fill that out, we would greatly appreciate it. Thank you all so much. We are planning lots more great discussions like these for the future. So please come back and visit the Survivor Circles page to see our latest schedule. But until next time, thank you, Angie. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you to everyone who's joined us. Have a great day.
Bye, everyone.